Greetings. Hi. I'm decidedly not David Bowen, but I am Jeffrey Summers, your host for this year's and today's seminar in African and African Diaspora Studies. Today, we are fortunate enough to have Representative David Bowen join us. He is, of course, our representative from the District number 10 of the Wisconsin State Assembly, representing us here in Milwaukee. David Bowen is also an alumnus of the University of Wisconsin, and he went directly from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee to the Wisconsin State Assembly. Thus, if you have any questions regarding is there a future after a university program of study at UWM, well, there you have your answer. There certainly is, as Representative Bowen can attest. Today, we're going to have David Bowen join us to talk about the situation with African Americans in Milwaukee, the Black Lives Movement, perhaps generally, where I know he has been active in activism and protest regarding the BLM movement, and what he proposes as possible solutions for the problems that plague our community. Representative Bowen, we're delighted to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Well, first, thank you so much for that intro and for the invite to be able to discuss, some of the current things that are happening right now in the movement. And I'd like to clarify, I am still a scholar of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So when the legislature and running for office at the local level called my name, being encouraged by the folks that were around me at the time, they pulled me out of my studies. So I'm still a scholar, but I'm honored to be one and to continue to pursue education at the university. So I know that there has been the whole world watching Wisconsin. We are the swingiest of swing states. We have race relations right now that are in turmoil. And we have a movement that is engaging in a resurgence of activism unseen since the 1960s in the civil rights movement. So what a time to be alive for us to be able to accomplish what our ancestors, what God has set for us to do in this moment, in this time. From what I can see, from the bird's eye view that I have, you have a state that is seeking the chance to change what the future looks like, especially for Black and Brown residents that have been given the short end of the stick beyond just police encounters, but in every aspect of life. And you have a very resilient new generation of fighters, of folks on the front lines that are willing to do whatever it takes in this moment to be able to alter that future, not depend on the chance for us to pass this on for our children to figure out, but to be bold enough to believe and to implement the actions and the changes that will get the change that we seek in this lifetime, in this era, and not lose this moment. So in the legislature, you've had inaction at the state level. At the local level, you had some piecemeal chances at reform. The biggest thing that the movement is asking for right now is transformative change. It is bold change. It is big change. To not reform our way to a solution, but to implement a brand new system of public safety that is accountable. It's not a question of if it's accountable, but it is built on accountability to the communities that they serve, especially the Black community. It is a system of public safety that also takes into account that you cannot ignore the investments that need to be made in local resources, local services, things that every family, every neighborhood, every child needs to be able to not only survive in the state of Wisconsin or in this nation, but to thrive, to have a shot of building their legacy of the American dream, and to be able to resemble some of the more economic access to economic gains, and just be able to invest in themselves like their parents and their grandparents once had through the booming decades where this was once the best place for Black folks to live, the best place for Black children to be educated, and to be able to return to that. So, but at the same time, you have a very bold, a very violent, a very, stubborn status quo that seeks to keep things the way that they are, that seeks to keep a system that benefits white people in their view and perception of public safety and safety through massive spending on criminalization, on punitive measures, on policing. And that is all coming to head in a very tumultuous presidential election. So the world is definitely watching Wisconsin and watching what is going to happen here, what is happening here. And both sides, as people sometimes describe it as sides, I say there are really no sides. There's only the future, the bright future that we all deserve, that we all continue to advocate for against people who don't want to see that future exist because they feel like they will lose their power, they will lose their privilege, they will lose the world as they know it. But the good news that I see is that that future is coming whether they like it or not, and that the bold changes that have to be in place, they will. The folks that are fighting for that are resilient. They are not stopping until they see that change. And that's a really good sign after 2016, when we had the chance to do this. We were in the same place in Milwaukee. We had the killing of Seville Smith on Milwaukee's north side in the Sherman Park neighborhood where I grew up. Ever since then, I had a chance to connect with his brother and his brother Sedan and his sister Sherelle, and their amazing family, just resilient in advocacy for systemic change. But we could not continue that movement at that time. All the stars are not aligned. People just got back to normal, and the usual ebb and flow of getting angry and frustrated for a short amount of time and getting back to normal was in well effect. And we all got into that comfortability. So this time is much different with George Floyd's death, with Breonna Taylor's death and murder, I should say, and Ahmaud Arbery's murder as well. We are in a significantly different place where it has not just sparked one city or several cities or one country. We're talking about globally the conversation of anti-Black views and systemic changes that have always been proposed but never implemented are back at the forefront. And I truly believe the folks that are fighting for it this time don't want to let this moment go. Don't want to let this movement go, because we're asking for a new normal along with the pandemic that has forced us to have a new normal. The coronavirus, which I ended up contracting earlier this year, and being it by the grace of God, put us in a position where, whether you like it or not, you have to make these adjustments and able to effectively operate in the world today and not get sick and not put the lives of your family at risk. That same thing, that same sentiment is being forced into the conversation on the changes in policing, the changes in making sure that Black families have access to all the things that they need, making sure that every system in academia, in government, in the private sector is aligning to finally address the concerns and calls for change that people have had for quite some time. So yeah, that's where we are, and I'm thankful I get a chance to serve. I'm thankful I get a chance to use my my platform and position in elected office and as a private citizen to leverage as much as possible the chance to protect the right to protest. This country was built on protest. This country was changed through protest, through systemic change and advocacy for it when folks in positions of power did not listen. So the same folks that left up the Boston Tea Party also must recognize that protesting, and even in that case of the Boston Tea Party, looting and destruction of tea led towards making this country better. It led towards the systemic change that some people were fearful of and pushed back against. But it forced folks to recognize that good can come about from those situations. The same way, like in Milwaukee, I was just at the Sherman Phoenix location, a hub of 30 some Black businesses right on the north side of the city. Same building that was burned down in a uprising has been redeveloped and redesigned to be able to provide opportunity for Black entrepreneurs and the Black neighborhood. That same good can be produced out of the things that are happening right now. But we have to be bold in our conversations and the things that we're talking about changing.
Well, Representative Bowen, thank you for that sweeping overview of what our situation is currently and your hopes for what change we might see. Just in terms of continuing the discussion, and shortly we'll begin to engage some of our participants who will be forwarding questions to you. I'll field them and get them to you. In the tradition of, say, the British Broadcasting Corporation's program Hard Talk, I want to ask some rather direct questions, which might prove hard to answer. They are hard for me to think of answers to. But I'm going to begin with a bit of background analysis, if I may, of our situation here in Milwaukee that complements, and in some senses, also restates or says really more or less what you have already so eloquently asserted here. But, you know, I'm thinking about our situation in Milwaukee. As you said, there was a time a half century ago when this was arguably one of the better places for African Americans to grow up and live in. You know, for sure, we have a rather unpleasant, ugly history of racism here. But the industrial past of this city, plus its former high level of unionization, created jobs for the working class, which allowed them to live at middle class standards of living. Now, unfortunately, I think for African Americans in Milwaukee, that period only lasted for a generation, maybe two generations at most. So it really didn't provide the kind of platform and the building of wealth over a sufficiently long period of time to launch many African Americans here in Milwaukee into the professional middle classes. And then we saw this, you know, just with deindustrialization, which hit this area harder than just about anywhere else in the country, this terrible fall for African Americans in terms of income and wealth. Many white Milwaukeeans, they left the city for the suburbs, but for those who stayed, the level of income marginally declined, only by a couple of percent for white Milwaukeeans, but again, well into the double digits for African Americans. So I'm thinking about how do we build that new future, and I'm going to mention just a couple of other things if I can that align with your remarks. So we have the problem of policing, and there, of course, we have a hyper segregated central city in Milwaukee that sees a level of segregation that is arguably unmatched in any other part of the country, combined with poverty, intergenerational poverty, and we then have a policing culture which has become, I think, increasingly violent. Some have argued, such as myself, that it's partly a consequence of police who are increasingly recruited from the armed services after they return, and they've been in these, forever wars in the Middle East and Central Asia, where they're engaged in policing of people of color and treating them oftentimes, as is the job of the military, rather roughly and violently. And then, you match that with an already existing police culture of violence in the United States. It has a long history, as we know, and you have the results that we're all familiar with. And then just one more point, and that is the 2008 economic crisis. This country never recovered from that, and so we saw that while employment recovered, people's wages did not, and they became increasingly insecure. Many people fell through the cracks in terms of various social benefits, healthcare, et cetera, access to education, especially higher education, became more expensive. And so we have a generation of young people who have very little prospect of entering the middle class. These are some very complicated problems. I mean, how do you think we can begin to engage them all?
Yeah, and that's a mouthful. So
Yeah.
if I miss anything, feel free to remind me.
Of course, we're in dialogue here, so please.
Yeah. So first off, that history of the city is important to recognize, and that's fueled by the Great Migration, right, of Black families moving to Milwaukee and Chicago and Detroit and significant northern cities, especially in the Midwest, for work opportunity, for the chance to be able to provide for their families. And if you adjust to what the economy was like back then and the qualifications that you needed, or how accessible it was to be a part of the workforce back then. I still hear stories of folks quitting their job one day and getting hired on another job the same day. Like they would quit at lunch and go work at another company after lunch. And literally it was that easy.
Right.
And not for, jobs that were, paying low wages, but jobs that actually allowed workers to have access to benefits. And, I always highlight the retired folks in my district right here on the city's north, east to west side. We're about to the 30th Street corridor, 35th and Capitol. You had folks that worked for companies where they could retire and buy a boat and pay for their grandchildren's education on top of the education they already took care of for their own kids. So, there's a very stark difference of just what's accessible to the families on the north side of the city right now, as far as transportation and as far as work opportunity. Much of the positions now are in service sector, and they're low wages, and there are no benefits. Since you talk about having access to healthcare, that's not even a question for a lot of folks. But the best solution, I believe, is access to the 21st century economy that a lot of people have been shut out of. So you've had high growth areas of the economy in tech that a lot of Black families, a lot of Black workers, a lot of Black entrepreneurs haven't been able to crack through yet. And there wasn't a massive effort to transfer folks from that rugged manufacturing sector and time to even high-tech manufacturing that we have and know today, that you need a certain set of skills to be able to work into. And those jobs are the ones that provide those good wages. Tech companies are the ones that are providing those positions that you can find your true value in the economy. But a lot of people don't have access to that. So
Right.
making sure that transition is real, making sure that those investments to be able to get people there are real is a big part of the equation. We also know that just having access to good paying jobs is not enough, right? We know that Sterling Brown, a Milwaukee Bucks player who can make millions, still can be treated without the dignity and respect that he deserves from the police department that should be there to serve and protect him too. And that's how deep rooted I would say the issue of police brutality and overuse of force is in our community. One of the good things that the movement was able to do was to be so consistent in their fight for justice daily. You have some of the biggest, like the most consistent protest movement in the country, the People's Revolution here locally, now at about 105 days, maybe straight. At about day 70, the Fire Police Commission announced that they would move forward in challenging the police chief's position. And they demoted him from Chief Morales from his position. And he was just very disconnected to the real calls for change, the real calls to challenge. I would say a police culture locally that lifts up mistreatment, that lifts up not being willing to advocate and give Black folks the dignity that they deserve in every police encounter. It's also fueled by a very white and a very top-down police union that doesn't seek to serve solutions that actually benefits the community or residents. They usually end up protecting officers that end up committing the worst heinous acts. And then, you have a divided community as well, that some folks will defend those actions by officers. So the issues are so deep-seated that you have to address it at its root. Anything that does not seek to address it at the root will just end up allowing that same toxic police culture that defends wrong, that fails to be accountable to Black residents and communities. It just allows it to perpetuate and stay. So we definitely need to make sure that police leadership is not aligned with keeping the status quo, but is there to challenge it. You definitely need to make sure that there are policies, even though the state right now is not taking action under Republican leadership and a divided, Democratic governor that wants to push them to do more, but they refuse to. You definitely need more policy changes at the state level to be able to hold officers accountable, to change the use of force standards across the board, across the state, so that if you are Jay Anderson Jr., for instance, and you are killed in Wauwatosa by a police officer, that was his second killing. That was Officer Joseph Mensa's second killing in Wauwatosa. He would go on to kill Alvin Cole teenager at Wauwatosa at Mayfair Mall, because of the difference in standards and protocol. Literally, by the time of Jay Anderson's death, the Wauwatosa Police Department had no use of force standard under the same chief that's been there for decades, right? So, you need police departments and every law enforcement agency to implement best practices across the board. And I think the Barack Obama administration and DOJ tried to, steer police departments in that way voluntarily through their task force, their 21st century policing task force. It had everybody at the table, but it still was an option. And we have to get to a point where there is no option to be able to implement those changes, because lives depend on it. So, I do think of the solutions from that angle. Making sure that standards are across the board, and there's a minimum, a basis that no police department, no law enforcement agency can fall under. And then there also needs to be investment. So I think this is where the conversation on defunding the police takes hold, because every municipality, every state, the nation has incentivized police departments to not only chase the worst practices, but their governments have been spending hand over fist on policing and corrective and punitive measures, rather than investing on the front end in communities so that they have access to quality education and recreational services and basic needs services and housing. All those services, even in mental health and wellness, that should be there. Communities have been spending pennies on those, and by percentage spending dollars on policing only. So, with the 53206 zip code in my district that overlaps it, the one solution, the one investment that has uncapped spending is corrections, is criminalization in that neighborhood. There's not a massive amount of dollars going into everything else to make sure the families are staying afloat and having the things that they need.
Just thinking about an analog, David, to the national level, it's kind of like the military, isn't it? I mean, with both the military and policing, there's almost no limit on spending. Everything else, we're told there's no money. But
Exactly.
but with these two things, nobody ever mentions, a budget deficit, or that there is an economic crisis, or there are again these limits to what can be invested in those two areas. But everything else has to be cut. Education has to be cut. Any kind of human services have to be cut. And it seems as though we have this double standard. We're not looking at things more holistically in terms of what might provide the best human benefit, but also just from a cost-benefit analysis, what might actually be cheapest. But, we are very, very quick to resort to that force button, and thinking just locally here as well. And by locally, I mean the state of Wisconsin. It seems, and this must be something that you confront daily and are frustrated with. I mean, we have a very gerrymandered state legislature, which prevents us from taking certain actions at the state level. And of course, we saw how that worked also, some 5-6 years ago when the state of Wisconsin stopped Milwaukee County from requiring that its police officers reside in our county, that they could come in from the suburbs, live out in the suburbs and work here. So it seems as though many of the measures that we could take to improve our policing situation are blocked by a state legislature that doesn't always act in the interests of some local communities such as ours.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. There have been a number of decisions made at the court level, at the local level. The good thing about this era is that it's raising the awareness for the public, for folks in the movement to pay attention to more than just your presidential election, right? It raises the importance of your DAs and your district attorneys making prosecuting decisions, if they're prosecuting at all, questioning the relation between DAs that work with local police departments and personnel all the time and may be influenced by the decision to prosecute the same folks that they work with. It's raising the awareness of judges and judgeships, of people that are stepping up to recognize the plight of folks that are struggling, dealing with oppression and dealing with systems that are very adamant on quote unquote law and order, but rather than addressing the lack of law and the lack of order when police officers provide and engage in misconduct. So that's the good thing about this era, that there's been this really big adjustment and people are paying attention to all these other levels of government and intricacies that make decisions that people weren't aware of before.
Sure. If I can pose another tough question to you, David,
Sure.
I'm old now, so I have historical perspective just from my own life, but I've seen the Democrats, the past 30, 35 years, push this line that education is somehow the answer to the challenges that we face, and especially that African Americans face in terms of being able to attain, stable middle class living standards, escaping poverty, etc. But you would think that, given the fact that I'm in higher education, that this is something that I would be advancing as a line of argumentation for solving some of these problems that we have. And certainly education is important. I don't want to suggest that it isn't. I think it has great intrinsic value just in and of itself in terms of human development, and it even has economic benefits as well. But when we were talking about the industrial past of Milwaukee, I'm thinking about those jobs. Those were actually many of them low-skill jobs. So there was nothing that was inherently challenging about them. They weren't particularly high skill. And in fact, as industrialization matured, the jobs actually became ones that required less skill rather than more. But what made those jobs high paying was the importance and the power that labor unions had. So they were able to impose high wages. And then those high wages actually saved us money in other areas. I mean, we needed to put less people in jail. We needed less social services. When people are in decent jobs, their personal lives don't suffer as much. And so we don't have as much of this human fallout from cultures and societies which are under so many pressures from a lack of just basic resources being present. To what extent is your party moving away from this idea that somehow we just need to provide better education and that's going to solve these issues? I mean, it really seems we need to do something about the minimum wage, which is at a frightfully inflation-adjusted low level. I mean, it's not even, frankly, it's where it was in the early 1950s, if you adjust for inflation. Mm-hmm. So it's where it was some 70 odd years ago. And we've had a hell of a lot of increases in productivity since then. So it should be much, much higher. How do we get the minimum wage up? How do we get Medicare for all? How do we return to free or close to free public higher education, which again is something that a lot of states had, including Wisconsin. If you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, the cost of tuition was next to nothing. And in some states, such as California, it literally was completely free. Can we get ourselves back there, and can the Democrats unite around these economic issues that would really disproportionately help African Americans more than any other population.
Yeah. It's one of the things that, it kind of reminds me of the press release I put out after Jacob Blake was shot in the back 7 times. From the time I got elected in 2012, there's been name after name and hashtag after hashtag. This has been the one issue that we have not been able to see any movement on when it comes to police accountability and, making sure that we ensure that Black lives are actually respected and dignified in this country and in the state. And it was clear that I had to speak to Republicans who were being obstructionists, but also some of my Democratic colleagues that weren't giving this issue the urgency and the priority that it needed. And they might be the same ones that still wear a Black Lives Matter T-shirt or have a yard sign.
Right.
And I had to tell them that we need more than just words. We need more than that. We're going to need action. We're going to need real urgency, and the passion that is put towards other issues has to be put on this issue as well. And that it's okay to focus on Black people. I think sometimes it's seen as like a negative that you can't. But if anything, we definitely should put a focus on Black folks and their issues and this era and this moment in time, because the damage has been infringed on them. So I think that's a big thing that I think about as I hear your comments on the other struggles that have not broken through. Much of the party, and I was a leader in the Democratic Party for our state. I was state vice chair for 4 years. So seeing the intricacies of the party apparatus and engage from that angle, there is a shift towards a more progressive, a more bolder part of the party, base of the party, that's continued to grow and that's continued to have its hold. But that's also in the same vein of, maybe a traditional group of folks in the party that are as bold in their thinking, as progressive in their thinking. So you're seeing those two things pretty much continue to butt heads sometimes as you look at the primary for the presidential election or some of the primaries that are happening on the state and local level too. So those dynamics are happening. I think the party is going to continue to lean towards a more progressive stance in the future to come, and it'll continue to grow as well with time. But also you have folks that are engaged right now that they aren't the ones that are just supporting a party for the sake of supporting a party and choosing sides traditionally that way. The folks that are especially advocating in the movement right now, many of them are independent. Many of them are even to the left of the left. And many of us are, I usually say, like, we're so left sometimes we can go right on certain issues. So it's interesting to see that dynamic and to see that change. But you also have I would say on the other side, on the right, you kind of have the same thing. You have a extreme right that is rooted in, they're having their own challenging of the traditional right, the more established right. And even if they aren't, usually I would say they weren't really welcome in those same spaces before, like Donald Trump has opened up the floodgates for them to be able to have these folks that, can have views that even the Republican Party would probably shun. So
Right.
It's just interesting to kind of see that dynamic happen, and see how things play out this presidential election cycle, and
Sure.
which side ends up taking a hold of the larger party apparatus. So I think traditionally in the presidential election we just had, you had a Bernie Sanders wing and you had a more moderate Biden wing,
Hmm.
and the Biden wing still held on. So
Right.
I think time only tell, like, when you might see a shift where the more progressive parts of the party end up taking a hold of the party apparatus the same way Donald Trump's infiltration has happened and has taken hold too.
Right. 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 David, I'm going to offer one more observation, perhaps question, and then we'll get to a couple of the questions that we have here from some of our participants. But it seems to me, and this is related to the last point that I made, is that one of the ways in which capital, for lack of a better term, responds to these moments of protest is by trying to offer representation as a means of de-escalating the larger social conflict. So representation is important, of course, but bring more African Americans into upper management jobs at corporations. Bring more of them into university administrations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All good things.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems as though that's where they want to stop. That if they can just have that greater diversity or representation within elite or professional circles, that's fine. That they can stop there. It really doesn't cost them anything, and I think that's the point. Is that it's a proposed solution which really comes at very, very little cost. And I'm just wondering what you're seeing on the ground in terms of the will that exists to go further. Again, to try and get that minimum wage up significantly, to try and extend health benefits to all. Again, make higher education available to people at very little cost. I mean, in short, do you think it's different this time?
I think you're comparing like this era in time to others in the past.
Well, I'm also looking at responses, say, from the New York Times or other national media outlets who I think operate on two levels in terms of these questions of social justice. One is, again, representation at the top end of the type that I've just described, and then also trying to ensure that there's some degree of social justice at the bottom end of the socioeconomic pyramid that would take the form of, say, reforming police departments, et cetera, all needed. But where they stop is in advocating a transfer of resources to labor and to the middle classes, and especially, of course, which would primarily affect and improve the lives of many African Americans. And I'm just wondering if you're having some sense of whether or not there is going to be pushback from, say, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and of protesters to say, that's not enough. We actually need a real transfer of resources to working people.
Yeah. I think that's well within reach. That folks will advocate for it. That are on the front lines right now. The good of the conversation around defunding, that as you continue to see polls show that it's the the advertisements and the demonizing of the movement that has gotten people weary of supporting the movement or supporting the demands of the movement at this point, rather than people not believing that Black folks are deserving of change or things of that nature. But I also, I think about it from the standpoint that you had a tax bill that shifted $1.9 trillion to the wealthiest of the people of this country.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't any discussion about if we could afford it or not.
Right.
And the same dynamic that we're now challenging on the other end is to say that we spend so much money on policing, we spend so much money on prisons, we spend so much money on these punitive reactive measures after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
And then some people claim that they're doing it for Black communities. They'll claim that they're doing it for working people. But we know at the end of the day, like it's still a setup. And it does not get to the investments that need to be made that, as you go back to, were always made in this country. I was able to confirm that MATC was free up until about in the mid 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
Where literally your federal Pell Grant or whatever that was like it, an
Mm-hmm.
automatic allocation per student. If you fell under the income guidelines, it was completely paid for.
Right.
Right. And then if you were going to a four-year university, with the investments of 2/3 funding from the state and the federal allocations that were made, if you did have a tuition bill, you could pay for it with a part-time job.
Right.
Like that is mind-blowing to the young people of our generation. And we're like, what are you talking about?
Right.
And, to work 20 hours a week and to be able to say that like you paid your tuition is absolutely insane in this current climate.
Yeah,
But that's exactly what the folks behind us had access to.
Right. I mean, it used to be that a lot of our young people, they literally could pay for their entire tuition and even living costs at, say, the University of Wisconsin by having a summer job. They worked on a construction crew, and that was it. That was enough money. That would carry them through the entire academic year. Well, Representative Bowen,
so I do see a disconnect really quickly. I do see a disconnect with some of the folks that are a part of like the moderate part of the party, where they believe that we can't afford free college. And I try to explain that same exact scenario to them before, in the 70s and before, and they're like, then the light bulb goes off like, oh yeah, we also did provide enough investments where it was free.
Yeah.
But they can't fathom that now. They can't fathom, having tens of thousands of dollars in student debt being wiped away. They can't fathom that the cost of education could be so low where it was accessible to them. But it's amnesia. It's literally them just forgetting the fact that how it was set up for them is the same way it should be set up for us.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right on that. And that's an excellent point. David, I'd like to just move on to some of the questions that we have just very, very quickly here. One of our participants asks, what is the central policy that you would advocate for a passage in the state legislature that might have some realistic chance in the near term of being passed that could really help Black Milwaukee residents?
Yeah, I think there's so many things across the board that we should have access to. As you talk about the immediate needs of the Black community, there are so many services and things that every family depends on that should be there that aren't right now. that need to be. So we have to have, in my view, an investment, a direct investment into Black communities across Wisconsin, Black families across Wisconsin that have, been exposed to plunder. Literally, they have been the wealth they would have had access to if it was not due to systemic racism in housing, systemic racism in education, systemic racism in a number of life points that have altered the quality of life their families have access to, that the state should intervene and make sure those resources are there. I can't ignore the changes that should be there in public safety and law enforcement as well. So people finally are respected and are treated with the dignity that they need, even in public safety. And I also think about, the things that we need to do so that families have, especially Black families, have access to the high growth sectors of the economy.
Right.
It is safe to say that those, how easy it was to get in the workforce before and have access to high paying jobs immediately and within your own community, it won't be coming back anytime soon. And that takes years, if not decades, to be able to put together. So I'm a fan of a minimum income.
Universal
Dr.
basic
King
income.
talked about, universal basic income, that Dr. King talked about in his platform as well, as we just celebrated the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington.
Right.
We know for a fact that the dignity from work can also still be coupled with the dignity to be able to take care of your family.
Right.
And that it does not disincentivize work, but it complements it to make sure everybody in our country can get by.
Representative Bowen, I'm so glad you mentioned that last point, because as it so happens, our ever-talented moderator and program associate of our academic department, the African and African Diaspora Studies department, Rachel Hegland, and I published a paper together a couple of years ago on just that topic, or at least it included as a central point the jobs guarantee, a full employment program that Martin Luther King advocated. And is this something that we can, in your estimation, begin to talk more about? I think it's something that it actually resonates with a broad swath of the population. I mean, people they tend to, instinctually regard work very favorably. It's not something that I think some of your colleagues across the aisle in the state assembly would view with any great favor. But there is a fairness dimension about it that I think many people would support. I mean, do you think that this is something that would resonate with your colleagues in the state assembly, and should it be talked about more?
Definitely should be talked about more. There are changes in criminal justice that other right-leaning states with, frankly, more Republican control than us, or more tradition of Republican control, that they're able to implement and change and close prisons and move in that pathway, move in that level of progression that we aren't able to do here. And I think some of that is rooted in the deep-seated white supremacist views and perspectives that really hold Wisconsin back from being able to do those things. We also are dealing with some of the most extreme people on the right as well in Wisconsin compared to some other parts of the country. So that can't be ignored. But there's no way around it, right? In a state that has built its history on hard work, on industries that have impacted the whole country, I still think that even with you can still complement that history and make sure that all the residents and citizens of our state, as Andrew Yang talks about a dividend, right? You design it as you are a stakeholder, you are a shareholder of the economy, and this is your payment for it, rather than the viewpoint that Republicans or sometimes folks on the right, conservatives, try to paint it as welfare. Literally, it should be looked at as a bond. It should be looked at as an investment, and you are getting paid out on that investment for, in a sense, choosing to build your livelihood and legacy in this country, in this state. I look at it that way, and it would definitely still be a hard sell to some folks just because of how entrenched those views are in Wisconsin. And at the end of the day, who it benefits, right? There's a significant amount of Black families that would benefit from changes to that degree. And I think it helps innovation. It helps to position our state and our workforce and our entrepreneurs to be able to then go on and create more things to benefit the economy.
Right.
Be able to have a world where evictions are don't even exist anymore, right? Families aren't being kicked out of homes, and they're only leaving by choice because it's not that they can't pay their rent. It's just based on what their preference is. That's a completely different dynamic, and evictions and incarceration and things of that nature end up having a ripple effect, affecting not just those families but the whole neighborhood as well. So, I look forward to being able to have that conversation in the legislature, and this point where we'll have new maps. There will be a point where the dynamics in the state, the pendulum always does swing, and one side will have it and the other side won't, and then the other side might not have its way, but they have their say, and then the other side will get the pendulum back, and
right.
They'll have their way, and the other side can have their say.
Sure.
So it always does swing. Let's hope that still exists, because if it doesn't, we're in trouble.
Right.
And we still need a way to be hopeful and to believe that things will absolutely change.
Right. Before we conclude, I just want to make one last observation, if I may. And you've been very generous with your time, so thank you for joining us. But Harvard's electoral.
I'm sorry, I can't be on video too, so that's my apologies.
Well, we just had a technical wrinkle, and we'll work those out, of course, as we go forward with our series. But Harvard's Electoral Integrity Project ranked Wisconsin dead last of 50 states on its index of democracies, and by that, states that have electoral district maps that represent the people of the state. And in fact, they have a 0 to 10 scale for rating democracies, of which Wisconsin, unfortunately, rates a dubious 3, which places us on their index as an authoritarian country, if we were a country. So it would seem as though we should not have to suffer too much in the way of lectures from a group of people who brought us this state of affairs in terms of our present government. In other words, I don't think it was democratically arrived at or by any means a choice of the people. It really has been imposed upon us. But I don't want to take us into another area of discussion, which could go on for quite some time if we engaged it. I want to thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to following your career and the many accomplishments which you surely will have going forward in the State Assembly. So, Representative David Bowen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the invite again, and looking forward to more discussions.
Great.
Make sure you send me that your paper on minimum basic income. That'd be great.
We'll certainly do that. For those of you who were able to join us today, our apologies for a delayed start. Again, we had some technical wrinkles. This is our first seminar of the academic year. We will certainly iron those out as we move forward. And we do have a seminar series, I think, that is well worth attending. We have Mark Levine as our next speaker. Professor Levine, formerly of, well, he's still with UWM, but he's now a professor emeritus, published the report on Black Milwaukee in July, which has received not only a great deal of local attention, but statewide, national, and even global attention. So that is something that that report that we will try and get posted to our website as well. And you can review that in advance of his talk. We have Jason Moore of the State University of New York at Binghamton, one of the most impressive historical sociologists and geographers in the world, who will be talking about the relationship between capitalism, its current crisis globally, and its implications for people of color. We will follow that, we are hoping, in February with Noam Chomsky, a scholar who needs very little in the way of introduction, literally the world's most living cited author on earth, and he will be giving us his observations on the current protests that we're seeing, especially BLM, and situating that within a not only global context of protests that are presently sweeping around the world, but also his participation and in an observation of protests, which he has been engaged with over the last 7 decades. And then we have some other speakers coming as well, which we will be making announcements for. So we conclude there. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel Heglin, for putting everything together. And again, we look forward to seeing you in the future. Bye-bye now.